right, so here we have our student, our coding by hand here. So the first thing we want to do is kind of figure out the order that this code is going to run in, following kind of where we go, line by line, and what's happening. So remember, we always start out our line of code. Java's always going to start at the public static void main line of code, and it's going to run this bracket. And once it gets and runs that bracket, the code's over. So it's only going to run what's between those brackets. And hopefully, if we made good code, at some point we're going to jump down to all the other stuff in the code. Obviously, if we don't use the other stuff, then it was just wasted, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but is maybe an inefficient thing. So let's start off with that. So then the very first thing that's going to happen is we're going to do system.out.println number right there. We are then going to create number 1. We're going to create number 2. And then we're going to create a problem. So problem 1, object 1 equals new problem 1. And that means that we've created object 1. So then we can move down to this line of code, so number 2. And it says object 1 dot do this, number 1 and number 2. And when we call that, that means that that is a method that we are calling. So before we move on to any line of code, we have to go down to the method called do this. So it takes in num1 and num2, which we have, and then we do int num3 equals 3, system.out.println num1 plus num2 plus num3. Cool. And once we finish this method, so we do everything in the brackets, and that means we're going to jump back up to right there. We're going to finish that line of code and then move down to here. And here is object1 dot also do this. We're going to run that line of code. And then that's going to tell us, though, oh, we're calling another method. So let's move down here and let's do this method called also do. We're going to run all of that. And then once we get to the end of the bracket, we're going to jump back up to where we ended. And then we're going to keep moving on with our code and finally print out that last statement. So that will be the order that we kind of do those parts in. And once again, once we reach this bracket, we are done with our code. All right, another one here. Okay, same thing. Once again, we're always going to start with that public static void main. So we're going to start here, and our code's going to go from here to here. And once we reach that bottom bracket, we are done. So first thing we're going to do is this line of code. And then next after that, we're going to create number 1. We're going to create number 2. We're going to create this problem 2 object. And then we're going to get to this line of code, object2.do this. We're going to run that. But because that is a method, that means we are going to jump to right here and complete this method. Which means then we're going to do all of this. So we'll hit that line up there. And then once we get to this bottom bracket, we're going to jump back down and move on from that line of code. So that means we're going to jump down to object2.also do. And because that's a method call, we're going to go up to the method. Once again, we're going to do this method here, also do, which means we're going to print this out. And then it says this dot do this, which is now another method call, which means we're going to jump to here. So we're going to run this a second time. And when I get to this bracket, it means we're going to jump back up here, which then ends this bracket, which means I can jump back here where we started. So notice your code is going to jump all over the place because every time you call a method, it stops right there and it goes to the method that you called. It's going to complete that method and then eventually start finishing everything off. All right, and then last but not least, after we've done that, we're going to system.out.println number 1 and number 2. All right, so let's get into some vocabulary. A lot of these things I've been saying in the past, and I know that they've mentioned in the videos, but here we can take a look at this and we can get down to exactly what we're talking about with these kind of things here. So first thing here, A is a method call. So in this piece of code, we have 2 method calls. So we have right there and right there. Both those lines are method calls because we are calling a method. B is a class heading. So this is where we're going to declare a class, which will be right here. So public class problem 3 is going to be our class heading. All right, so for part C and part D, they are a little bit different than what you might know them by. So actual parameters can be called arguments, and formal parameters can be called just parameters, is usually what we call them. So our parameters, or our formal parameters, are going to be when we have a new method. They are the data that is going to be needed to complete that method. And the arguments, or the actual parameters, are when we call a method, the pieces of information that we're sending to the method. Remember, the arguments and the parameters have to match in order for it to be able to compile without error. So notice that for the part D there, right, our parameters were 3 ints, and for part C, our arguments were 3 ints each time. All right, E is talking about local variables. And local variables are variables that are used just in a small piece of whatever. So in this case, they're going to be local to the method that they're in. So this and this, so G and H, int G and int H, are going to be local variables because they can only be used within test. Also, we have object 3, which is going to be a local variable because it can only be used in that main method. I'll underline those local variables as well. F is a method specification. This is going to be our public void test. And all that means is that it's going to tell us exactly what's kind of going to be part of that method, right? So it's going to be public, it's going to be void, and it's called test. G, our method definition, is going to be this entire line of code here. So it's going to include all of the parameters as well as the method specification. And then H is our method body. That's going to be everything that's in the brackets for our method. So when we talk about all of our information there, that's kind of the vocabulary that we're using and terminology that we're using to describe these things. Notice we did talk in E, the local variables. Don't forget our instance variables are variables that exist for the entire class. So for example, if I said here public class problem 3, and then I had an int x equals 0, I could use that x anywhere in the class, and that would then be considered an instance variable. All right, so we have our FRQ practice. Remember, these are just little parts of FRQs that we could see on the AP test. So here we want to write a method that takes 3 integer parameters and prints their sum. Remember to declare your method and its parameters. So for this, we just want to literally kind of work and translate English into Java. So we're writing a method, so public We don't have enough information about whether this should be static or not, so if you want to include the word static, that's fine. If you don't include the word static, that's totally okay as well. But we do know that we have to make this void. Because it doesn't tell us anywhere here that it's returning anything. It says print their sum, it doesn't say return their sum. So public void. And then we can call this method, it doesn't tell us what to call it, so we can call it whatever we want. So maybe we'll call it public void sum. Alright, so we wrote a method, and it's going to take 3 integer parameters. So now we need to include that. We can definitely include whatever we want here, so as long as there are 3 integers. So I'll call it int x, int y, and int z. Parentheses, start my bracket, and my bracket somewhere over here, and we're good to go. Alright, so let's continue reading. It says, and prints their sum. So all we got to do is just add those numbers. So we can do this one of 2 ways. So we can just say return, and then do a plus, I already forgot my variables, x plus y plus z. Boom, done. And that's totally okay if we want to do. Except the fact that I just told you we're not going to return anything. So hopefully you caught that mistake. Instead, we're just going to do system dot out dot print. Okay. Or if we want to, so first of all, this is good. This is great. It has everything we need. What we could do is we could create a variable here, and we could say int answer, and we could set that equal to x plus y plus z. And then instead of printing x plus y plus z, we could print answer. Pros and cons of either way is basically what the point is of this. So if we're going to do something else with that answer, then it's a lot easier to put it in a variable, because it's going to be a lot easier to just reuse that word rather than saying x plus y plus z over and over again. But if literally the only thing we're going to do in this is just to do exactly what it says, then it's probably easier to do it the other way, because that's only 1 line of code versus 2 lines of code. But typically I do like creating variables. It makes it just a little bit neater and easier to use. Alright, so for this one, we have this method called public static boolean is even, and we want to make that method. So we're going to start off with our brackets. First thing we need to do is we need to test if it's even, so we're going to do that by using modular division. So we'll use an if statement. If in mod 2 is equal to 0, we're going to return true. Otherwise, we will return false. All right, and that's it for number 1. Just a couple of clarifications. So notice this could say else, and that's totally okay. But it cannot say else if. And then like n mod 2 not equal to 0 or equals 1 or whatever the case is. Because then both of our return statements are inside an if statement. And because of the way Java works, you have to make sure that there is a return statement for all possibilities. And so logically, we know that the number is either even or not even. But according to Java and the compiler and the computer, who's not as smart as our logical skills, it sees that we have 2 return statements attached to if, and that's not okay. So you need to have a non-if statement return statement. So, but otherwise, you can say, once again, it with an else, that's fine, or just nothing. Number 2. All right, so we get our brackets all sorted. All right, and for number 2, we want to basically round it, so whatever that double is. So for my if statement, I said a minus int a. So just a reminder that what that's going to do. So let's say our number is 6.2. A would be 6.2. Int a would be 6. So 6.2 minus 6 is going to be, 0.2. And so then if 0.2 is greater than or equal to 0.5, we're going to take our int a, which would be 6 in this case, and add 1 to it, which would round up to 7. But since 0.2 is not greater than or equal to 0.5, we're just going to int a and return 0.6. I'm sorry, return 6. All right, to find the following mistakes. So our first issue with number 3, once again, pause the video, try it on your own. But we're trying to return something, and it's a void method. So remember, you cannot return something that's void. Number 4 is the exact opposite. We're supposed to return something, but we're not. We're printing it out. So instead of that system.out.print line, we'd like to return, and then return that. Number 5 kind of goes back to number 1, what we were talking about. So currently there's a return statement for the if, but what happens if a is not greater than 70, right? This method has to return an int. So we would need some sort of also like return 0 or something like that. So what's going to happen if that if statement doesn't happen? So there we go.